Hello! Welcome to the podcast, There is No Spoon. The most important function of the first half of life is the socialization of an individual. We learn to live in a complex world, full of implicit rules. However, this introduction is not complete. On the contrary, we are limited by the conditions in which we find ourselves. The place of birth, family characteristics, environment and school, all these set the initial conditions that influence how we relate to the world and, more importantly, in the context of our discussion today, which paths we choose. One can talk endlessly about freedom of choice, but even if it exists, it applies to an adult individual capable of understanding the options and having the resources to choose freely. Freedom is not a gift. It is a privilege, and something that sometimes must be fought for. But today, we will not talk about freedom, but rather about the limitations imposed by such a situation. We do not develop holistically as we would like, but only within the narrow framework, the blinders, of the socio-cultural context in which we find ourselves. One of the most important tasks at the midpoint of life is to become aware of these boundaries and explore what we have previously missed. For Jung, it is related to the concept of the inferior function. Strictly speaking, what I described earlier is socio-cultural influence, the way society, culture, and the people around us shape our personality. However, I have left out another important aspect: biology. All people are different. In Jung's time, certain biological aspects were not yet known, but now we understand that our psyche is also shaped by our genome. People may have different levels of nervous system sensitivity. This can have a significant impact on behavior. If a person lacks stimulation, stimuli that excite the nervous system, they will seek it out and experience an inner drive towards it. This may manifest itself in a more active lifestyle. Conversely, if the nervous system is highly sensitive, the slightest external stimulus will suffice. Such people may be content with a quieter way of life. In general, the conditions we are born with are not only socio-cultural, but also biological. In one of his early works, Psychological Types, Jung proposed his own classification of people. Naturally, this should be regarded as a simplified model that merely systematizes known information. But for the purposes of today's discussion, this is more than enough. So, what is the main idea? Jung suggested that people perceive the world differently. Some need to organize everything systematically to learn a life lesson. Others need emotions and feelings to realize something. Some require a corresponding experience. You may have noticed this among your friends and family. Seemingly, the same experience can lead to completely different outcomes. Jung observed this as well and identified 4 key types, which he called functions: thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation. Thinking is related to rational and logical processes. Feeling involves less precise, but still logical processes associated with assessing the importance of something. For example, you may know that something is very important to you without being able to explain why. You simply know. This knowledge is well-founded, perhaps based on past experiences or emotions, but it lacks a purely logical justification. This is the feeling function, the ability to assess the significance of an experience based on one's emotions. Intuition speaks for itself. It is an orientation toward the future and the ability to see connections that do not yet exist. Visionaries and scientists making groundbreaking discoveries belong to this category. A well-known character from Harry Potter, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, was one such figure. He constructed complex and long-term plans, seeing future possibilities. Many of these plans might have seemed strange to a rational or feeling-oriented person, but as we know from Harry Potter, they ultimately led to success. Sensation is about being present in the moment. I perceive only what I experience through my senses. The ability to live in the present and gain life experience through direct experience, characterizes this type of person. These are the four functions Jung identified. In addition, there are two orthogonal dimensions: extraversion and introversion. The first refers to an outward orientation, i.e., deriving energy from interactions with others, while the second refers to an inward orientation, meaning that social interactions drain energy rather than replenish it, whereas solitude and a calm environment restore energy. The orthogonality of these functions means that they are independent of each other. This results in 8 possible personality types: extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing, extroverted intuition, and the same 4 for introversion. This typology is fascinating, but why am I bringing it up? Because Jung observed that people usually have a so-called dominant function. This is how we typically interact with the world, what we constantly rely on, what comes naturally to us, and what we are predisposed to. You can trace this in your past decisions. On what basis did you make them? How did you solve problems? How did you overcome difficulties? The dominant function, according to Jung, is innate. I would add that the socio-cultural context also plays a role. For example, in the modern world, much encourages the development of the thinking function, which tends to dominate the others. The dominant function is our strongest trait. But what interests us now is not that, but rather its opposite, the inferior function. According to Jung, this is the function that is least developed. It stands in direct opposition to the dominant function. Thinking opposes feeling, and intuition opposes sensation. If your dominant function is thinking, then your inferior function will be feeling, and vice versa. The inferior function is something we try to avoid because we are not skilled at it. More precisely, we are not just unskilled, we are not naturally predisposed to it, nor have we developed it through experience. In the first half of life, a person seeks to use their dominant function. Sometimes other functions develop alongside it, but according to Jung, never the inferior one. Here lies the most important conclusion for us. At the midpoint of life, we may have developed 3 functions to some extent, but not all. One might think, so what? If we are not skilled in our inferior function, does it really matter? After all, we cannot be skilled at everything. And this is where Jung's genius comes into play. He realized something very important. The most profound insights, the most significant experiences that foster our growth, come, paradoxically, through the inferior function. A brilliant thinker abandons their way of life due to an overwhelming surge of emotions. An emotional, feeling-oriented person gains a crucial insight through reflection and systematization of accumulated experiences. A person who has always lived in the moment suddenly realizes they have no future. A future-oriented person realizes they have never truly lived in the present. The inferior function is the key to our growth in the second half of life. By this point, we have become quite proficient in our dominant function. Some may have even exhausted it, leading to a dead end. But this dead end can only be overcome in one way: by embarking on a journey into the unknown, toward our inferior function. Let's put this thought on hold for now and approach it from other perspectives. First, one might argue that Jung was a great philosopher and his theories were brilliant, but science has advanced since his time. To this, I would say that the same idea is well expressed in other fields. For example, consider cognitive science. What quality is crucial for well-rounded personal development? Plasticity, the ability to step beyond familiar patterns. This is useful not only in work, but also in life. New experiences and sensations make our story fuller and richer. Neuroscientific research shows that trying a new sport or new food stimulates cognitive development. At the very least, this can delay the onset of degenerative diseases. At best, it allows a person to remain active until the end. The midpoint of life is a critical juncture. By this time, people have usually learned how to navigate the world. They have well-established solutions to most problems. They know how to live. But this can lead to stagnation and excessive conservatism in the second half of life. Do you want to live this way? Development is impossible without something new. And to experience something new, you must embrace what you have never encountered before. The same story can also be interpreted from an existential perspective. As we remember from earlier episodes, Rollo May introduced the crucial concept of existential guilt, a guilt that arises before oneself for choices not made or for those that were avoided. I could have become a doctor, but I became a chef. I wanted to play the piano, but I joined a tennis club instead. This leads to existential guilt for missed experiences. As you can imagine, this guilt continuously accumulates, as a person is constantly faced with choices. By the time we reach the midpoint of our journey, we carry a significant burden of these unresolved choices, with certain clusters of experiences that we consistently deny ourselves. If we continue to live this way, it inevitably affects our mood. Existential guilt is a weight we constantly carry. If we do not start shedding at least some of the heaviest burdens, we will soon begin to feel the strain. How can we do this? By living out the experiences we missed, learning to cook, learning to play the piano, starting to do the things that, for some reason, were left undone but deeply desired. Ultimately, different approaches lead us to the same conclusion. Life should become fuller and more integrated if we want to successfully navigate the midpoint of our journey. This brings us to the question, what should we do? There are some general answers, but of course, each life story is unique. So the main work falls on the individual. Different approaches allow us to examine this question from various perspectives. The Jungian approach points to the inferior function. This leads to a simple idea. Try to identify your dominant function. It is easy to recognize because it is what you naturally excel at. Knowing this, it is also easy to determine your inferior function. Once you understand your inferior function, you can find the direction for your personal development by strengthening it. Consider what actions you can take to give it proper attention. What do you lack? If it is thinking, try engaging in structured activities like formal education. If it is feeling, choose experiences that cultivate emotions, dancing, socializing, or increasing emotional expressiveness. If it is intuition, try building long-term plans based on subtle patterns of probability. If it is sensation, then it is time to embrace the present moment and live here and now. In general, try to find something that interests you and helps develop your inferior function. Cognitive psychology suggests that the midpoint of life is a time for entirely new experiences that prevent stagnation in cognitive development, increasing our mental flexibility and making us more complete individuals. The existential approach, on the other hand, helps us determine where to focus our efforts. Where there is a lot of guilt, there is also an opportunity to be freed from it. It is time to do what we once feared, what we constantly avoided, but which never disappeared. It remained with us. In short, it is time for change. I was planning to conclude this episode here, but I would like to recall one more concept. Jung introduced the idea of enantiodromia into psychology. This phenomenon frequently occurs during crises, including the midlife crisis, and involves a person suddenly shifting an aspect of their life to its complete opposite. I believe each listener can recall examples of this. As the saying goes, there is only one step from love to hate. However, enantiodromia is not a good thing. Any extreme leads to undesirable consequences. It may seem that if we want to develop our inferior function, we should do the opposite of what we are used to. But why is this problematic? Because the underlying intention should be, I want to become more whole, rather than, I want to reject my past life and start anew. The first half of life equips us with essential skills for functioning in society and solving life's challenges. This knowledge and experience are valuable. They should not be discarded. They should be supplemented with alternatives. A person who cannot control their emotions is flawed. But so is a person who has no emotions at all. A person who cannot live in the present is lacking. But one who lives only in the present will not be successful either. Our past is a testament to our strengths. We should not reject it. However, it also highlights our weaknesses, ones we now have the opportunity to work on as we reach the midpoint of our journey. This was the podcast, There Is No Spoon. Until next time.